My name is Ramine Cromartie, and welcome to Risk Management Professionals webinar series. The key speakers for this webinar will be myself and Katie Simone, who will be joining us later. Our producer, Tim Lee, will be in the background to be sure we're fully functional. What you see on the screen is a video image of the speakers and a PowerPoint presentation. The audio and PowerPoint presentation are being recorded and will be available shortly after this webinar. We're going to be using a GoToWebinar interface to support our presentation. You should have a small box on the screen that has an image of a speaker and a larger box that contains the PowerPoint presentation. Those sizes are adjustable. If you grab the interface point between the two boxes, you can adjust them to best fit your viewing device. You will also have a dialog box for questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them into the question box, and we'll be sure to answer them after the presentation. In the left corner, there's a box that says Webcam. You can use it to pull down your menu and adjust the position of the speaker to your liking. This webinar series is part of Risk Management Professionals' ongoing outreach program. RMP's core competencies and expertise reside in EPA risk management plans, OSHA PSM, CalARP, SIMS programs development, HAZOP, LOPA studies, and other hazard identification techniques, and a variety of other process safety and regulatory standards and regulations. RMP is able to assist many of its clients who prefer to use a consultant who utilize expertise and competencies in these areas. RMP's main objective is to share some of the insights that we've acquired over the years with each person viewing this webinar so that they can manage their own programs more effectively and evolve their administrating programs. Moving on, today we'll be covering compliance audits, not just a paperwork exercise. So we'll begin by providing a brief professional background of the two speakers, myself and Katie, and then we'll talk about the regulatory requirements and then get into an overview of the audit process, and then Katie will take over and provide some review tips for the prevention program elements, and we'll finish off with Q&A. So first, again, your presenters are myself and Katie Simone. Between the two of us, we've conducted compliance audits for a variety of industries, including ammonia refrigeration facilities, gas processing facilities, refineries, and municipalities. Over the course of our project work, we've worked with regulated entities as well as regulatory agencies and can provide insights on the perspectives of both. So first, for the regulatory requirements. There are 3 programs that can require you to implement a compliance audit program. If you're within California, you may be familiar with the California Accidental Release Prevention Program, also known as CalARP. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, also has its own program, Risk Management Plan, and then you have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's Process Safety Management Program. Now, each of these set of regulations has its own chemical list, and if your process meets or exceeds that threshold quantity, then that process could be covered under that particular regulation. The purpose of these regulations is to document that personnel are safely operating and maintaining their process that utilizes a highly hazardous substance. You want to ensure that your management team is devoting the minimum amount of resources needed or the resources needed to prevent accidental releases, including resources for training, equipment and maintenance, and personnel. Each of these regulatory programs has its various elements. First, for the submittal phase, if you've covered under the CalARP program, you're required to submit to your local administering agency. If you're covered under EPA's RMP program, then submittal to EPA's RMP CDX database may also be needed. Management program, you're required to do some management of your programs to document that you're managing the roles and responsibilities of those programs. For the hazard assessment, your off-site consequence analysis. And for the prevention program, which Katie will talk a little bit more, there are certain elements that you have to manage to ensure your compliance for safe protection of your personnel and equipment. And then there's a emergency response program, which may be applicable depending on your system and your capabilities. And I want to note that the OSHA PSM prevention program just manages prevention program elements only. So here's an overview of those various programs. On the far left, you have the CalARP regulations. In the middle, you've got the EPA RMP regulations. And on the far right, you have OSHA PSM regulations. And you can see with all 3, compliance audit program management is needed. With regard to the compliance audits, there are a number of requirements that are needed. First, certify this compliance audit. It's done every 3 years. Second, the audit team has to involve at least one person knowledgeable in the process. You want to document your deficiencies and be sure you have a process for addressing any deficiencies. And then from a record-keeping standpoint, be sure you're maintaining the last 2 copies of your compliance audit. So we've done an overview of the regulatory background. Now let's get into the process of how you go about conducting this compliance audit. First, in the preparation. Prior to conducting the compliance audit, you want to be sure you define an agenda and a schedule. You want to develop the agenda of the compliance audit to ensure the appropriate personnel that you'll need to be talked to are available. And these personnel are needed to provide the insight and the feedback that you need to complete all the various compliance audit elements. Secondly, we advise that you review the compliance audit inspection points. It's helpful to you as the auditor and your audit team to familiarize yourself with what's going to be needed in the audit process so you can develop in-depth interview questions. During the compliance audit, you want to utilize a sign-in sheet, conduct a coordination meeting, which we'll talk about a little bit later, utilize a method to document the compliance audit, and we'll give you an example as well, complete a document review, conduct the personnel interviews, and make field observations, and then close out with a closeout meeting. For the coordination meeting, the main goal is to get all of your key stakeholders on the same page and ready for what to expect over the next day or days. You want to explain the purpose of the compliance audit, review the covered process and any changes that have happened since the last compliance audit if applicable. Identify any key stakeholders. Again, you need one person knowledgeable in the process, another person who's knowledgeable in the regulations and the requirements so they can interpret the requirements. Have an individual who's in charge for the overall responsibility of the program management, your CalARP coordinator or your RMP coordinator. And have the individuals that are responsible for delegated sections of the program, i.e. maintenance personnel, inspection personnel, personnel that runs the training programs at the facility. And then we advise you complete a walkthrough of the covered process. This will be very helpful to give you perspective as you do the deep dive into documents and into the interviews so you have a working knowledge of the process. For the compliance audit check sheet, you want to ensure that it meets all of the regulatory requirements and it provides a record of the participants who are participating in the compliance audit. You want to have a method that's efficient and works for your system and allows for easy recommendation follow-up. We've provided an example of what we use here at RMP, and we'll walk through the various checklist items. So first, you have the regulatory citation. This references where in the regulations you are looking at the inspection item and can be helpful looking forward. We have a recap of the regulation being audited and evaluated. This column, it says compliant or no, and it allows the facility to provide a general assessment of whether they deem that they are meeting the requirements of that regulation. And I do want to note that ultimate authority for this is for the CUPA. They determine if you're ultimately compliant or not in a given regulation. A comment section where you can provide a roadmap of where all the necessary documentation is being maintained. And you can also summarize your interviews and any field observations. And then if needed, space to provide a recommendation for your gap analysis. And you want to enter it right here in the report so you can easily track which regulation it's tied to. And here at RMP, we export all these recommendations into what we call a recommendation action tracking log, and we'll go through an example of that. So you have your recommendation ID number, the recommendation itself for easy tracking. You have the person assigned to make sure the recommendation is being closed out, and a target date of completion. And enforcers and agencies like to see this so they can tell that there's a time frame for closing out recommendations. So it's important that you make note of that target date. When you go ahead and close out the recommendation, there's a space to provide a summary of action tracking for the closeout of the recommendation. And this is very helpful as you do periodic reviews of your recommendation. It's a status update and provides a running log of actions taken toward that recommendation closeout. And the actual day that the recommendation is resolved, you want to go ahead and document that, and then be sure to change the status to closed. Documentation review is an important part of the compliance audit process, and you want to ensure that you have adequate time to go through all the different prevention program elements that are listed here. And to summarize and wrap up your compliance audit program, you want to conduct a closeout meeting, which will be an initial review of the results of your compliance audit with all those that participated. You want to be sure that when you issue your final report, there are no surprises. You can also use this as an opportunity to brainstorm opportunities to improve your program and identify any deficiencies, and also assign the responsibilities for recommendation tracking that we discovered and mentioned earlier. So Katie Simone will talk a little bit about review tips for the prevention program elements. Again, if you have any questions, please enter them in the dialog box, and we'll be sure to talk about that after Katie finishes her presentation.
Thank you, Ramine. Can I have that? Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to go through a little bit of the prevention program elements. I'll start with some key audit insights that we found when we've done compliance audits for clients. First, we want to start, the first question I ask when I go there is I ask, what have you done in the last 3 years that probably was not documented, or if you were good, was documented. And that's once I have those updates in mind, that's something I'm looking for throughout the whole compliance audit. Has it been updated in the PSI? Did they do an MOC? Was there a PHA necessary? Things like that. The next thing is you're going to look at document revision numbers and the dates. Again, if there is updates, you want to make sure that maybe their PNIDs have been updated since their last update, and then other sections as well. It's, as we said in our title, it's compliance audits. They're not just a paperwork exercise. You got to go out and you got to interview individuals. You got to interview your operators, and you want to make sure that the operators, they're using those procedures that have been made for them. They're following them. They're up to date, and it's good to gather all the documentation at one location. We like to get all people involved with your entry level. Gather all your documentation into one location in your coordination meeting, and all your key personnel. You're going to kind of figure out who's in charge of what program, who you're going to ask for each specific program. You want to make sure you're looking both at documentation and the implementation of that program, and you want to make sure that your documentation matches up for what you're implementing, you're doing. And you want to also look for opportunities to strengthen your program. You may be compliant, but maybe there's a more efficient way to go about what you're doing, and it's great to have objectivity. You want to take the regulator's perspective. They're the ones that are going to come, and they can be the ones that are going to fine you. And we think that we've seen what a regulator can come in and look at, and we think we have some suggestions on how to make sure that the regulator will be happy, but also what is working for your facility. Some best practices, again, you want to make sure you're meeting those requirements, but it's effective for how you run your facility. Are you using technology that's different than last time you updated your program? I've seen in a lot of facilities, everyone is moving to an intranet with all their documentation, and it's not necessarily always documented in their prevention programs that they're storing their files and stuff electronically. And then as you're going through, you want to make differences between recommendations versus suggestions. A recommendation is going to be what's going to make you compliant. How are you going to get there? A suggestion is maybe how can you be more effective in meeting that compliancy. You want to make sure you're tracking your recommendations and you're following through with them. You don't want to leave them open for an extended period of time. And then you want to make sure that you are retaining your records and they're up to date. I'm going to walk you through a couple of the prevention program elements. These are for Program 3 elements. Due to time, we will not go through all of them. However, there is many similarities between a Program 2 and a Program 3 program. So we'll start with your process safety information. The biggest thing is you want to make sure you have the hazards of your process. A lot of time, the MSTS for your chemicals, your covered chemical, is going to contain a lot of those information about the hazards of your chemical. You want to make sure that's up to date, and that your employees know where to find it in the case of an emergency. You want to have information pertaining to the technology of your process. So your overview of your process, is it documented correctly? Do you have one? Your maximum intended inventory, again, have you updated your facility? Did you update your maximum intended inventory? Any administrative control changes? You want to make sure those calculations are present and correct. And then for your safe operating limits, a lot of times we're going to see a reference to the operating procedures, or you might see it in your PSI section as well. You just want to make sure that those references are correct and that they're easy to follow for yourself, the employees, and the regulators. Some more information, your piping and instrumentation diagrams, your P&IDs. Again, did you do an MOC? Were your updates captured within the drawings? If the drawings are really old, you may want to do a field walk down to verify that these P&IDs are correct and updated. Did you add controls? Things like that. Your list of materials of constructions, electrical classification, design codes, and standards. We've seen a lot of the time that's going to be in an equipment manual that was given to you on construction of your facility. Make sure that's referenced properly, the storage location is available, and that anything that had been updated is also captured within those manuals. And then calculations or an explanation of the relief system design and ventilation design. I've seen a lot of times this is actually one of the deficiencies that I've run across. You don't have your relief design basis noted, or you can't find it. Just a reminder that it is an important part of the element because it is your safety relief. Your process hazard analysis, was it completed? Was it completed on the recommended timeline? Every 5 years is the regulatory necessity. Did they use the appropriate methodology? Are you using a what-if analysis for an extremely large gas plant? Or are you using the more recommended HAZOP methodology for the more higher level facilities? And then you want to make sure you have your recommendation follow-up. So if you made a recommendation during your PHA, was it closed out in a timely manner? And was that documented throughout in your action tracking log, as Ramine noted? Another thing to note about the action tracking log is it's helpful to contain all the recommendations from your PHA, your compliance audit, any incident investigations, maybe a CUPA audit, a regulatory audit. That way you can keep a master tracker handy, and it's easier to update, and everybody knows this is where the master is stored, and that's going to have your most correct documentation. Next, for operating procedures, you want to make sure that they are meeting all seven operating phases as noted by the regulation. So your initial startup, your temporary operations, your normal operations, emergency operations, emergency response. A lot of times, maybe you don't have a temporary operations, and a regulator made a claim in and say, well, where's your temporary operations? And you don't have one. So it's nice to note temporary operations, none necessary. Something like that, just to kind of give your operators and the regulators a clear path forward as to where things are going to be stored or if they're available or not. You want to make sure that they're synchronized with what the operators are doing within the field. What I like to do is grab a couple samples to interview the operators with. So I'll take maybe an initial startup, maybe a temporary operation if they have it, an emergency response, emergency operations, and go through it with the operator, ask them, hey, what do you do first? See if that's matching up what's on their operating procedure, because you're expecting that these operating procedures are up to date, the operators are using them, and they can be a great training tool for any new employees, and you don't want to have your new employees trained in the wrong way. You also want to make sure that these are reviewed annually. So you're looking for that annual certification list. This is a Program 3 requirement. Program 2, you just need to update it as you go. But it's important to make sure that it is documented, whether it be a sign-in on the top of your operating procedure or a centralized list for all your operating procedures. For training, you want to make sure you have a training program in place. What are they training on? Are they training on the operating procedures, the hazards of the system? Are they aware of the prevention program elements? Do they know where they can find a lot of this information? You want to make sure that each employee is given an initial training when they first start working for the facility, and then a refresher training, so every 3 years. A good thing to look for is ask for a list of all the employees and verify versus their training records that all employees have been up to date. This is a very simple thing to do, and it doesn't take much time to make sure that everyone's up to date. Mechanical integrity, this is your preventative maintenance. A lot of times you may use a contractor for this. You want to make sure that you have your records of your contractor. And if it is someone on site doing it, you want to make sure you have their records as well. including a documentation of where those records can be found. You want to make sure it's including all equipment of the regulated process, that they have a formalized schedule for the maintenance tasks, and they have a means to document that maintenance is being completed. So that's your records. One thing to note is you want to make sure that operators and maintenance employees know how to correct these deficiencies, or how to make aware of these deficiencies to the management. Do they know, okay, I need to fill out a work order? Do they need to submit a request? Things like that. You just want to make sure that that path of communication is open. For management of change, again, this is one of the first questions I ask when I go there. Have there been any changes to the covered process? If there has been, you need to make sure they have that documentation, and you need to make sure that documentation hits all elements of the required management of change program. I like to ask operators if they are aware of what is the difference between an in-kind change and a not in-kind change. Maybe they've done a change and they were unaware of it. Maybe they thought it was in-kind but really ended up being not in-kind. I believe that we have webinars that talk about that as well for more information. And then for your pre-startup safety review, this is going to be after a major MOC, or you're starting up a new portion of your facility, a new construction. Have you done any? A lot of times you don't see many PSSRs for smaller facilities, but you want to make sure that if you were to have to do a PSSR, you have a program in place and a procedure to complete that PSSR. Then for your compliance audit, again, you need to have them completed every 3 years, and it's great to list the participants, make sure that you have someone who's familiar with the process and someone who's familiar with the regulations. And then you want to make sure that recommendations have been followed up. I like to have the last compliance audit handy so that I can reference if all recommendations have been closed or not. And then kind of gives you a good eye as to far as what has changed in the last 3 years, if they've changed how they're recording or taking documentation. And then incident investigation. You need to make sure that they have procedures in place to report any incidents. That's 48 hours within, they need to start the investigation after an incident. They need to have the proper team members. Did they develop a report, and was it communicated to affected personnel? And then you also need to ask, has there been an incident? Look for any completed incident reports, and then those must be retained for 5 years. One thing I've noticed as a deficiency is that you must report near misses, and that is not always overlooked. So if your PSV pops, you want to make sure that you're kind of investigating why that pops. It's meant as a safety device, not as a regular operation. So that's one thing to keep in mind moving forward. For your employee participation, you want to make sure you have a written plan. How will you notify employees if you update the PSI? How will you notify employees that there's a PHA? Are they aware a PHA is happening? Maybe they want to become involved. It's necessary to have an operator involved with your PHAs, and you just want to make sure that they know where they can get this information, because ultimately the goal of this is to prevent, or to help with their safety and to prevent any accidental releases. When you have your operators involved with the process and operating the process, a lot of the responsibility falls on them to prevent these accidental releases. Your hot work procedures. Do you have procedures to issue hot work permits? Do you have records of these hot work permits? Are they being maintained on file? Does the employee know where they can go to fill out a hot work permit? Do they know what is defined as hot work? Things like that. And then for contractors, a lot of times for smaller facilities we see that maybe they're not doing the evaluation of the contractors, but it's important because you want to know if you're contracting out services, are they doing a safe job? You want to make sure you're keeping an eye on them to make sure that they're going in the right direction and following your safety policies. Again, just look for those contract records. And then at the end of the compliance audit, you're going to have a list of recommendations. If a deficiency is made, you're going to want to note that, make that recommendation. Again, suggestions are for maybe improving the efficiency or effectiveness of your program. And then you want to make sure that these are closed out using your action tracking log. The most common deficiency we find is that people are not addressing their recommendations. It's important to note that you may have closed out your recommendation on the field, but have not updated it in the action tracking log, and that is still considered a deficiency. Another thing to note about recommendations is that you are allowed to say, no, we don't want to do this. OSHA has made a guidance for PHA recommendations. Maybe during the PHA, someone's mind was confused, and the analysis upon which the recommendation was made contained factual errors. The recommendation is not necessary to protect the health and safety of employees and contractors. Maybe it was made for monetary gains, and you can go ahead if it's not working out, and then maybe there's a different way to address that recommendation, or the recommendation isn't feasible. The important thing to note, if you are going to decline a recommendation, is you need to document that, and you need to make sure you are stating why you are doing that. So a regulator doesn't come in and say, well, you can't just say no. They want to know what your frame of thought was. And then it's important to assign an individual responsible for following up on these recommendations. If there's a name put to a recommendation, they're going to feel more responsible that it's finished, and they'll follow it out to completeness. You want to assign an anticipated date for completion on every recommendation. And then again, once they're closed, you want to mark that on your action tracking log. Again, even if you do complete the recommendation on the field, but you have not documented and said that it is now closed, that is considered a deficiency. Your prevention program is a living document. As you see in the blue, the compliance audit is the evaluation of how you're doing, what can you improve. You don't want to just be compliant and that's it. You want to kind of go above and beyond, because this is your employees you're protecting, it's your neighbors you're protecting. You want to avoid all these accidental releases. A general review, you want to make sure you have the appropriate team. You have a method to document these results. As you saw from Ramine, we showed you our matrix, and then you want to make sure those regulatory requirements are met. Review the supporting document, interview personnel, and look for program implementation. Importantly, you need to be objective. The regulator is going to be objective, and you want to kind of have that bird's eye view of a regulator. And last but not least, follow up on your recommendations. So that's all I have. I think we have a couple questions. I'm going to bring Ramine back up here, and we'll see where that goes. So, Tim, do we have some questions?
So the first question, and if you could repeat it after I ask it, if operating limits are mentioned in the operating procedures, does it need to be stated in the PSI as well?
Oh, that's a great question. We've seen best practices.
Repeat it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is, if your process safety, or if your operating limits are stated in your operating procedures, do you also need to cover them in your process safety information section? I mean, what we've seen with our experience with facilities is it's okay to keep it in one location or the other. You just want to be sure you reference it in your PSI section, that operating limits can be found in your operating procedures. And it also helps you keeping it in one location when it comes to updating. When you have multiple documents with the same bit of information, you can update one, maybe not the other, and then the person that is reviewing the document looks at the outdated version, and that could be a potential issue.
Right, next question. What's the best way to conduct an audit at a facility that has an ammonia refrigeration contractor handling the regular maintenance and inspection of the system?
Okay, so the question was, what's the best practice to conduct a compliance audit when you use a ammonia refrigeration contractor to do a lot of the work at your facility? We found that it's important that you invite the contractor to the compliance audit. You take that steps beforehand, because if they're the ones that have all the information, it's important that they're there for that compliance audit. I just recently did one with an ammonia refrigeration facility where the contractor was there, and he was very helpful and made the compliance audit go way faster.
So if a facility team member that needs to be interviewed is not available as scheduled, is a phone interview or an email correspondence sufficient?
Oh, so the question is, if a member of the audit team is not available, can you call them or send an email to get that information? And in our experience, that's sufficient. Is you want to be sure you get that information so that you can complete the audit. That requirement, that audit inspection point, isn't closed out until you're able to get that answer. So if you can follow up via email, you can give them a call and document that they participated, and via call or via email, then that is you're able to get that information, record that.
Mm-hmm.
What's the best way to identify where and how a facility is documenting electronically the program elements? Example, we have an online program for MOCs.
So the question is about electronic program elements and how do you document that. What I found is, especially in the case of a lot of people are going to an intranet or an online-based program, is that you maybe have a program roadmap. So you lay out all your prevention elements and then say, okay, the PSI, if it's located in your intranet, you can put out the whole file path. So the S drive, safety, PSI section. And then for online, maybe put the email address that your employees can use. The goal is that your employees can find this and use it, and you're implementing your program.
Mm-hmm. And what we've also seen is when we do these audits, to actually sit with the administrator of the MOC program and have them walk through the process so you can see how they go about entering and reviewing records too. And that helps me to kind of identify if they are meeting that regulatory standard.
So what is the definition of a knowledgeable person with regards to the system? What is required by the regulation, and what is the regulator expecting to see?
So the question is, what is the definition of a knowledgeable person, and what is the regulator expecting to see with regard to your audit participation team? And a knowledgeable person is anyone that interfaces and works intimately with that system. We've seen with the ammonia refrigeration systems, you have your refrigeration contractor who's knowledgeable of the process. They can troubleshoot, they can operate, they can make adjustments. And the operators there at the facility don't actually touch the equipment. They're just there for daily rounds. In that case, your knowledgeable person would be your refrigeration contractor. The question was, what for a more complex site where you have a gas processing plant with multiple process engineers, multiple operators, anyone that has insight and feedback and knows how to run that system, so your process engineers, your maintenance personnel, your instrumentation engineers, anyone that knows that system and operates and has responsibilities operating and maintaining it. Okay, great. I think there was one more I did note about the slide 10. There was a correction I do want to note. It mentioned 8 CCR for the citation. It should actually be 19 CCR. So thank you for the person that brought that to the attention.
Oh, one more.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So I work at an ammonia retail facility with only 4 employees. How big or small should the compliance audit team be?
So the question is, I work at an ammonia refrigeration facility with only 4 employees. How big does the audit team need to be? I'm assuming that maybe a couple of those employees are maybe operators. If you have one operator and then maybe a manager and a mechanic or a maintenance personnel, I think that would be a strong team. If they all have different responsibilities, I would expect them all to be available for the compliance audit. You just want to make sure all your bases are covered. That's it.
Do you want to mention the recording for that? Sure. So again, we just want to mention that the recording of this webinar will be available by next week. And also access to other, getting direction, perfect, no problem. And other recordings of previous webinars we've done are also listed on our website, which is newly revamped, so please check it out. And if you have any questions, Katie and myself are here. Our emails are there. You can email info@rmp.com. And just want to say thank you so much
Thanks
for your
joining
time.
in.